So why are vintage comics so much cooler looking? Well, I wouldn't say they're actually better, but they did have a boldness and confidence to their color palettes. I love 80s palettes, especially their weird obsession with primary colors. But modern digital programs allow you to layer and combine these stark, saturated colors in nuanced, interesting ways that weren't possible 40 years ago. You can create gradients or overlay different tones with blending modes like multiply, screen, or dodge. If you have the right mindset, you'll discover that you're working with the confidence of a stark, vintage color system while maintaining modern digital nuance. And if you're willing to abandon literal coloring, you'll end up with surprisingly striking visuals. And if you'd like to experiment yourself, we've put this high-res line art file and this color palette up here. You're watching a crime being committed, an art crime. Digital colors defiling sacred ink wash. Well, that's what some purists would have you believe. But I've always said that bad ink's strength is our ability to embrace both classic and digital workflows. And if you're a digital colorist who respects analog methods, then you understand that a piece like this requires a light touch. Delicate gradients, nothing crazy saturated or detailed. In a way, you're working more like a digital watercolorist, helping accentuate the actual brush marks that were scanned from the original paper. I'm deeply inspired by 80s movie posters, and the end result wouldn't be too out of place on the marquee of an old movie theater or on the cover of a classic adventure paperback. Definition of it's not that deep. It's just colors, bruh. Use any color you want. I 100% guarantee any casual comic fan isn't going to notice. It's interesting you'd say that, Bionicle Guy 32, because one of the best examples of using color for storytelling and emotional impact is Bionicle. In fact, let's sample 2 different Bionicles to create 2 different color systems, then make 2 versions of this amazing DJ drawing Lydia did. The water palette obviously features some nice sea blue colors, but it also has a secondary set of yellows that we can use to help our figures stand out. But as we continue layering blues back over the yellow with different blending modes, we start to create a united sense of calm, with greens, turquoises, and blues. The fire palette immediately creates a sense of intensity, perhaps even aggression. The reddish-orange at the bottom really accentuates the brighter yellow lighting up top. We can continue to accentuate this contrast by layering yellow and red gradients on top of the line art, helping create a sense that intense lights are starting to actually blow out the exposure of the image. And when you compare and contrast the 2 palettes, you can immediately see the different emotional responses they elicit. Even if you were a casual fan, you'd feel something subconsciously, even when you might think you're not even noticing. Let's turn this black and white ink wash piece into a colorful spaghetti western movie poster. These old western posters are incredible inspiration for highly saturated palettes. And the cool thing about working on top of scanned ink wash is you can use gradients and blending modes to try all kinds of looks and effects. I love stacking color layers below the ink layer, but also layering them on top, which can actually change the color of the ink and affect how visible the original brush strokes are. The most important thing is to use a light touch throughout. When coloring the horse and rider, let's treat the color more like digital watercolors that don't fight that heavy ink work. And when I'm laying in this vintage printed halftone look, I also want to knock it back a bit, so it doesn't fight the painterly quality of that original drawing. And just to sell that classic movie poster look, we'll grab the font Trash Cinema from Blambot and whip up a little title layout with some extra flourishes for character. At the end, if you hate it, you can start all over with black and white ink work and a totally new set of colors, because that's the magic of digital flexibility and analog inking. That looks so cool, but I feel like the machine blends too much into the background. It's not colored yet. After the coloring, it probably won't blend as much. What if I told you that you're both awesome for being followers, and you're both right and both wrong? Sort of. See, Lydia and I are pretty attuned to each other's style, and Lydia is telling me with her shading choices that she actually does want the sub to blend a bit into the background, so we can choose similar tones and values for the background and the sub. One thing I do want to pop is the bubbles coming off the back, as they'll be catching a lot of light. Where is that light? Well, Lydia has pushed the focus very clearly towards where the sub is working. So let's really push the brightness near the hands and on the very reflective windshield. In the dark ocean, that windshield is the surface most likely to light up from a strong light source. We can keep turning the lines on and off to see how and where our values separate. I actually think I can push the darks in the background even further, which helps accentuate that bright cockpit bubble. But maybe there are places I've gone too far, so I can actually work with the lines off to gently highlight areas of the craft where that bright light would probably catch it. So there's my attempt, and if you want to try coloring this yourself, we release layered scans of Lydia's pieces here. Some eagle-eyed viewers noticed that I forgot to color the main light on top of this submarine, and you're absolutely right, but also, we just haven't gotten there yet. The last video was all about directing the reader's attention using color. This is what I call narrative coloring, where your color choices point the reader towards key things in the story. And once you've established that narrative focus, you have to try and preserve it, which is why you sometimes run into dilemmas with secondary light sources. When I was first learning to color, I liked these big, bold graphical shapes for light beams. But here, it destroys a lot of that focus we built. And also, light doesn't always travel uniformly through water like this. But let's continue to darken the world around the sub, and then choose a more subtle color than bright yellow. My first thought was this sea green, which feels like yellow light shining through blue water. I love this color, but now there's not enough contrast with the sub's hand. One color I do like is the bright blue I used on the bubbles, so I'll sample that and use that here instead. It helps us create a graphical shape that still allows the arm to pop off the background. And with just a small yellow gradient at the light source, it now feels like a beam that's shining through dark water. And because the deep ocean isn't perfectly clear, let's use a halftone brush to create a sense of diffusion, like some of the light is catching sediment being kicked up from the bottom while the sub is working. And now you can see the before and after, where we've added our secondary spotlight, but the main focus is still clearly on the lower left. And if you still think I haven't done the line art justice, you can download the layered file and try your hand at coloring this exact drawing here. We got a lot of love for this negative space morel mushroom, but a few people commented that it would be hard to color something without an outline. So this is a good opportunity to show why a good colorist does have to know how to draw, because you need to have an understanding of shapes and form. In this case, Lydia has given me a blueprint, but it's up to me where the actual edges are, so I get to contribute a little more than just paint bucketing a shape. Color choice also matters a lot here, because I have to make sure the mushroom is always defined against the background. To help, I'll push the highlights a bit more than I normally would, which actually might create a fairy tale-like glow around the top and edges. Perfect for a cozy little mushroom on a green forest floor. We can continue to create contrast by using different textures. In keeping with the cozy fairy tale theme, I think a gentle paper texture over the green could be really nice. And to help it stand out even more, let's use a completely different texture on the mushroom itself. I love the pockmarked look of a morel, so let's continue the motif of repeating circles with a light halftone. From here, I want to keep pushing the romantic glow. First by actually affecting the line art itself, then adding a purple vignette as a complement to the green background. It's not my most detailed coloring, but it's pretty good for 20 minutes, and it evokes a quaint feeling that would work really well in a comic with a certain magical tone. I'd love to know how you'd color something like Camouflage in the environment the Camouflage was designed for, without it becoming muddy up close or at a distance. I think this is a super interesting challenge, because I'm mostly known for bright, surreal, retro comic-inspired palettes, but let's see what we can do. I looked at images of soldiers in camo, and I immediately noticed that the giveaway is the shadows, either because the people are backlit by bright skies, or because their clothing doesn't reflect light the way the foliage behind them does. As a result, if you squint, you can see their form as a darker silhouette against the rest of the environment. So, keeping that in mind, let's recolor this panel from Interdimensional 2, where Lydia has already drawn us a nice scene up in the trees, with a lot of sky, branches, and where I've already suggested a canopy of foliage with my coloring. First, I'll sample some nature colors from the background for our camouflage scheme, on both the outfits and the bike. Already, because of the composition, the figures are dark against the bright sky. But we can use a more colorful shadow than you'd expect to keep pushing the contrast without losing the charm of a bright, comic booky style. Just to make sure it's clear that they're wearing camo, I'll take a tan and spackle over the green outfits with some light suggestion of a pattern. The key here is not making the pattern too defined, or it will fight the definition in the line art. And we have one last trick we can unleash, which is painting lightly over the line art on everything in the background, while leaving the lines black around the foreground figures. It's subtle, and you probably wouldn't immediately notice it if I didn't point it out, but it greatly helps with definition and depth. Now, I know what you're thinking. The bright sky is doing a lot of the work of creating the contrast here. But what if you want your environment to be much closer in tone to the camo outfits? Well, let's take this other drawing, which I've set up in the same way, and now push the background to suggest much denser foliage, using the exact colors from the character's outfit for the background. Now, here's where we can use one last tool, textural variation. I'll use a halftone pattern across the whole background. And now, if we turn the lines off, you can see the figures start to be defined by that lack of texture. And if we want even more definition, we can use rim lighting in key areas around her body and bike. So that's my quick attempt, and if you'd like to try your hand at coloring this drawing, we just released the layered line art file and color palette here. I'm super interested in how you color using gradients. How do you position the gradients, if that makes sense? What's the thought process in placement and such? Well, I've actually got 5 ways I use gradients, and I'll show you them all. The first is just basic lighting gradients. In most scenes, there's an obvious main light source, like, for example, the sun shining down from above, which I exaggerate by brightening the background and subject at the top. Then, second, there's speed, motion, or direction effects. In this case, I can continue darkening the background behind the bike, or use a really vibrant color on the bike itself to enhance the sense that they're moving in a direction. This type of gradient isn't really correct to the lighting, but it makes the panel more dynamic. Next are what I call taming gradients. When you're using a really striking palette like this, you sometimes need to tone down the contrast in certain areas, such as this electric blue I've used for the chrome parts. This is basically a shadow gradient, but I'm using it more to tame the color a bit. Fourth is something you'll see me use a lot, which are atmospheric or lighting gradients on the actual line art. These only work if you're really careful with the opacity and don't overdo it, but they really help to create depth, especially if you have dust or smoke. Finally, we've got what I call a glue gradient. Basically, this is a final gradient that uses some combination of some of the colors in your palette, but applied across the whole piece, which helps create an overall sense of cohesion, gluing your drawing together. But thanks for an amazing question. And if you'd like to try coloring this piece yourself, we've uploaded the prepared line art file in a couple different formats here. How do you make your color palettes? And how do you make them unique and cohesive at the same time? Well, first, I just want to say that having a sense of color is one of the biggest misconceptions in art. To this day, I talk to incredibly practiced illustrators and painters who still make jokes about how they just weren't born with a good sense of color. But it's a learned skill, just like every other skill. And you can get better at picking palettes if you practice and pay attention to what works and what doesn't, and what emotions different colors and combinations of colors give you personally. And again, like a lot of things in art, you can practice by copying and borrowing from things you like. A lot of my palettes are sampled from old comics, just because I find those bright but limited palettes very romantic and nostalgic. But I also borrow a lot from movie posters of every era, because posters place a lot of emphasis on effective, emotionally charged palettes, and they often do it with a minimal amount of colors. And so this palette I've got is a combo of both an old comic and a new poster. And I picked colors that resonated with me but also work scientifically. And you're welcome to borrow this palette, sample it, and try it out for yourself. We even upload the full-res line art files for our members so they can practice on the exact drawings in our videos. Whenever I show multiple ways of coloring the same drawing, I get a lot of comments where someone says that they prefer one version over another. And first of all, I'd like to say that this is a totally valid opinion. If I show 2 or 3 similar pieces with different color schemes, your brain is wired to instantly pick a favorite. But keep in mind that this channel presents art through the lens of comics, and you can start to think like a pro comic creator if you free yourself from the binary of like or don't like, and instead start to think of different color styles as different narrative tools in your storytelling toolkit. For example, bright, saturated colors might be the look of your main story set in the present, but you might want to occasionally flash back to the 1800s, where a main character's ancestor plants hidden mystical artifacts that our heroes will stumble upon generations later. And then, when they do stumble upon them in the present, the deities inside the artifacts will gift them a brief vision of the future, which we could depict in panels with more of a surreal style, with neon gradients over the line art to give it a dreamlike quality. So I'm just saying, push yourself to try different techniques and styles, because the best comics use more diversity of palettes than you realize. What if you use a color palette opposite to how the feeling of the art is? For example, showing an aggressive illustration but the coloring is blue or sad blues. Oh, I can tell you what you get. My favorite genre on the planet, late 80s supernatural neo-noir anime, specifically Wicked City and Demon City Shinjuku, two graphically violent films that use blue, purple, and red in very pointed ways. And to answer your question, they do have intense sequences almost entirely in blue. I love this look, and I've always wanted to try it. And why not on this mutating chest-bursting piece Lydia drew last Inktober? I've always liked the backlit look of these old films, so I want to make sure the background is much lighter than the figure, at least up top, where the halo of light can really frame the dramatic chestburster moment. And that can, in turn, create nice rim lighting effects all over the figure, which can help define the legs especially, which could otherwise get lost in our monochromatic palette. For the monster itself, I want it to be part of the same cool palette, but I also want it to feel defined and separate from the human character. So I'll work backwards than how I did before, starting with a lighter color, then defining shapes and shadows with darker colors on top. At the monster's center, I'll use the only instance of violet in this piece. It's not a huge deviation from the cyan-based palette, but it does create a sense of otherness that adds to the drama. And you know what? Let's just keep pushing the intensity of the light behind him, and enhance that glow by bleeding some white light directly onto the line art. Now we're getting really late 80s. So I hope I've done justice to one of my favorite genres. And if you'd like to try coloring this piece, in any style at all, we've uploaded the full-res layered line art file here. Here's how old new coloring can help give any drawing a unique style. I've always been obsessed with retro coloring brushes. My favorite is the Craftone system from True Grit Texture Supply, which actually allows you to paint in halftone patterns in cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, creating a near-perfect simulation of the retro printing techniques that comics used up until about the late 80s. You can see here I'm replacing my placeholder colors with the CMYK combination that recreates them, using the special color guide that comes with the Craftone brushes. Now you could stop at this point and have a pretty authentic simulation of an old comic, but I like to go back over the old with techniques that are only possible in a modern digital program, like bright, smooth gradients, then play with opacity and blending modes to create otherworldly glows. Seeing the smooth transition on top of CMYK dots is such an anachronism, a literal collision of new and old. And on something like shiny leather boots, I love painting hard-edged highlights over the halftone pattern. The texture feels like full-grain leather, and the semi-opaque highlights feel like fresh polish. To create even more fantasy and atmosphere, I also enjoy putting gradients and lighting effects on the line art layer itself. And once again, it's interesting to see something so smooth against that retro dot pattern. Up until this point, I've actually been pretty mindful with my color choices. But you can also take advantage of blending modes to try color alterations over top of the entire piece, just to see how the mood changes if you make it warmer or cooler. This is what I call old new coloring, and it only took about 20 minutes total to bring this piece to a beautiful, semi-retro state. And if you'd like to try coloring this piece yourself, we just uploaded the full-res line art file here.